Welcome, weary traveler. Come in from the cold. The fire is burning, the kettle is warm, and there is always room at the Crossroads Inn for those who need rest. Tonight, we open an old leather journal, its pages soft with age and filled with the quiet handwriting of an innkeeper who has welcomed countless souls through his doors. Each entry captures a moment, a traveler, a story worth remembering. This evening, we follow the tale of a cartographer carrying an unfinished map, searching for a place that may no longer exist except in memory. Settle in. Let the fire crackle. Let the world outside grow distant. You are safe here. Let us begin.
The wind changed today. I felt it before I heard it, the way one feels a shift in the mood of an old friend before they speak. I was in the kitchen, my hands deep in flour as I kneaded dough for the evening bread, when the draft beneath the back door turned cold. In a way, it had not been cold for months. The chill carried with it the sharp, clean scent of distant snow, though the peaks to the north were still too far away to see from my window. Autumn has been gentle this year, lingering like a guest reluctant to leave a warm hearth. The oak tree at the crossroads still holds half its leaves, a canopy of burnished copper and fading gold that rustles with every breath of wind. But this afternoon, as I wiped the flour from my hands and stepped outside to check the woodpile, I saw those leaves trembling in a new way. Not the lazy dance of mild autumn breezes, but the nervous shiver of things bracing for what comes next. Winter is sending its first messenger. I spent the afternoon preparing. There is a rhythm to this work that I've come to love, a meditation of sorts. I checked the stores in the root cellar, counting barrels of salted fish, baskets of potatoes and turnips, the casks of cider, and the smaller barrels of ale. I brought extra firewood inside, stacking it against the wall near the kitchen hearth, where it would stay dry. I climbed the narrow stairs to inspect the guest chambers, ensuring that each room had sufficient blankets, that the shutters latched properly, that no drafts had found their way through gaps in the timber. The inn was quiet. Only 2 guests remained from yesterday, a pair of merchants heading east toward the coastal markets, and they left shortly after breakfast with their cart loaded with woolens and leather goods. They paid fairly, ate heartily, and departed with the kind of efficient courtesy that marks experienced travelers. I wished them safe roads and watched their cart disappear down the eastern road, the morning mist swallowing them gradually until only the faint creak of their wheels remained, and then nothing. By midday, the crossroads stood empty. The ancient oak cast its long shadow across the junction of the 2 roads, its branches reaching like open arms toward the pale autumn sky. I have seen this tree in all seasons, in all weathers, and still it manages to surprise me. Today, a single raven perched on its highest branch, watching the roads with the patient stillness of one who expects something worth waiting for. I returned to my work. The bread rose slowly in the warmth of the kitchen, its yeast scent mingling with the herbs hanging above the clay oven. Bundles of rosemary, thyme, and sage dried from the summer garden swayed gently when the door opened and closed. I swept the common room floor, pushing the rushes into neat piles and replacing those that had grown too worn. The flagstones beneath told their own history, smoothed by countless boots, darkened in places where ale had been spilled and scrubbed away 100 times. As the afternoon light began its slow descent toward evening, I lit the fire in the great hearth. The stones of the fireplace are old, older than my father's work on this building, brought here from some ruin that once stood on a nearby hillside. He told me once that these stones had been carved by hands that knew things we have forgotten, and I have never been certain whether he meant it literally or as one of those truths that lives between words. Either way, the fire catches quickly in this hearth, as if the stones themselves remember warmth and welcome it back. I was setting the iron pot over the flames, beginning the slow work of the evening stew, when the door opened. She stood in the doorway for a moment, framed by the gray light of the fading day, her cloak pulled tight against the wind that had followed her in. She was not young, perhaps a decade or more past her middle years, with hair the color of iron shot through with streaks of silver. Her face was lined in the way of those who have spent their lives squinting at fine details, and her fingers, as she pushed back her hood, bore the blue-black stains of ink that no amount of washing can fully remove. Under her arm, she carried a leather case, long and cylindrical, the kind used to protect rolled documents from the elements. It was worn at the edges, the leather cracked in places and polished in others by years of handling. She held it the way that one holds something precious, close to her body, protective. "Good evening," I said, stepping forward to close the door behind her. The cold air retreated reluctantly. "You're welcome here. Come, warm yourself by the fire." She nodded, her eyes moving slowly around the room, taking in the wooden beams above, the tables and benches, the dried herbs, and the steady glow of the hearth. I recognized that look. It was the gaze of someone who spends their life noticing details, cataloging them, fitting them into some larger picture that only they can see. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was low, a little hoarse, as if she had not spoken to anyone in some time. I was not certain I would reach shelter before nightfall. The road was longer than my map suggested. "Maps can be deceptive," I offered, guiding her toward the fire. "The roads have a way of stretching when the weather turns." She smiled at that, a small expression that softened the severity of her features. "You speak as if the roads have their own intentions." After enough years at a crossroads, one begins to wonder. I took her cloak and hung it near the fire to dry. Beneath it, she wore practical traveling clothes, a wool tunic over a linen shirt, trousers tucked into boots that had seen many miles. Her leather case she set down carefully on the table nearest the hearth, her hand lingering on it for a moment before she finally let go. "I am called Elara," she said. "I am a cartographer, and I am the keeper of this inn," I replied. "You are welcome to food, drink, and a bed for as long as you need. The stew will be ready within the hour, and there is bread fresh from the oven." She thanked me again, and I left her to warm herself while I returned to the kitchen. Through the doorway, I could see her settling onto the bench, her eyes drawn to the flames as they danced and crackled. But even as she rested, her hand kept returning to the leather case beside her, touching it as if to reassure herself that it was still there. I have seen many travelers pass through this crossroads. Some carry their burdens in sacks and bundles. Others carry them in the set of their shoulders, the shadows beneath their eyes. This woman, I sensed, carried hers in that worn leather case. Whatever was inside, it was more than paper and ink. It was something she had been carrying for a very long time. The stew simmered, the fire burned outside, the wind grew colder, and the first true night of the turning season settled over the crossroads like a blanket drawn up to the chin. I did not know then what her maps would show me or what memories they would unearth from the hearts of travelers yet to arrive. I knew only that she had come here for a reason, as all travelers do, and that the crossroads would reveal that reason in its own time. For now, it was enough to offer warmth and food and the simple gift of shelter from the cold. After she had eaten a bowl of the root vegetable stew thickened with barley and a thick slice of the fresh bread still warm from the clay oven, she sat by the fire and simply stared into the flames. I busied myself with the evening tasks, sweeping the kitchen floor, banking the coals in the clay oven, checking the level of cider in the barrel. But my attention kept returning to her, this quiet woman with the ink-stained fingers and the worn leather case. There is a kind of loneliness that sits differently on a person than ordinary solitude. I have seen it before in travelers who have been on the road too long, or those who carry burdens they cannot share. It is not the loneliness of being without company, but the loneliness of being without understanding. The sense that the thing you carry is too strange, too personal, too much your own for anyone else to comprehend. Alara carried that kind of loneliness. I could see it in the way she held herself, slightly apart from the warmth of the fire, as if she did not quite believe she deserved it. I could see it in the way her hand kept returning to her leather case, touching it like a talisman, or perhaps like a wound that would not heal. I did not ask her about it. There are questions that belong to the questioner, and questions that belong to the moment, and questions that belong to no one at all. The best a host can do is create the conditions for speaking, and then wait. The fire settled into its evening rhythm, crackling softly as the larger logs caught and began to glow. Outside, the wind picked up, and I heard the ancient oak tree creaking its familiar song. The shutters rattled once, twice, and then fell quiet as the gust passed. "Your inn is well built," Alara observed, her eyes still on the fire. "The walls are thick. The chimney draws true. Many inns on the road are not so carefully made." "My father built it," I said, "with help from neighbors and his own two hands. He chose the timber himself, felled it in the forest to the north when he was a young man. He always said that a building should be made from materials that know the land." A wise man. In some ways, in others, he was as foolish as any of us. I smiled, remembering. He spent 3 months building the hearth, testing different arrangements of the stones until the fire drew just right. My mother said he was more attentive to the chimney than he had been to their courtship. Alara laughed softly at that, a sound that eased something in her face. "But she understood," I continued. "She knew that what he was building was not just a structure, but a promise that this place would stand, that it would welcome anyone who needed shelter, that it would be a good place, a true place, a place where the roads could rest. And has it been a good place? I considered the question. I thought of the travelers I had welcomed over the years, the merchants and pilgrims and wanderers, the families fleeing hardship, and the soldiers returning from war. I thought of the births I had witnessed in the private rooms upstairs, and the deaths I had sat vigil for, when there was no one else to do so. I thought of the stories I had heard by this fire, and the secrets I had kept, and the small kindnesses exchanged between strangers. It has tried to be, I said finally, and perhaps that is all any place can do. Elara nodded slowly, as if this answer satisfied something in her. The candle on the mantelpiece flickered, though there was no draft I could detect. I glanced at the white candle that had burned since that first winter, and for a moment its flame seemed to lean toward Elara, as if recognizing something in her that I could not yet see. Then a moment passed, and the flame burned straight again, and the night settled around us like a blanket drawn close against the cold. The 18th day of the falling leaves moon. The cartographer did not sleep well. I heard her moving above me in the night, the soft creak of floorboards as she paced in her small chamber. Once, near the deepest hour of darkness, I heard what might have been pages rustling, or perhaps the whisper of a map being unrolled and studied by candlelight. I did not disturb her. Some burdens are too heavy to carry in the presence of others, and the night offers a privacy that daylight cannot. When she came down for breakfast, there were shadows beneath her eyes, but her hands were steady as she accepted the mug of chamomile tea I offered. She sat at the same table as the night before, near the hearth, and again her leather case rested beside her like a faithful companion. "Did you rest?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "After a fashion," she said. "I am not accustomed to stillness. The road has been my bed for many months now, and a proper mattress feels strange to me." I nodded, understanding more than she perhaps intended. The road changes a person. It makes stillness feel like a kind of waiting, as if something is always about to arrive or depart. The morning passed quietly. Elara took her breakfast of oat porridge and honey, and then settled into a corner with her leather case open before her. From where I worked, I could see the edge of a large piece of parchment covered in ink lines and tiny notations. She studied it with an intensity that seemed to block out everything else. Her fingers tracing invisible paths, her lips moving silently, as if reciting something from memory. It was mid-morning when the second traveler arrived. He came from the south, on foot, his boots caked with the dark mud of the lowland roads. He was an older man, his hair gone entirely gray, his face weathered by sun and wind into a landscape of deep lines. He moved with a slight limp, favoring his left leg, but there was nothing frail about him. His shoulders were broad, his hands large and scarred, and he carried himself with the careful awareness of someone who had spent many years watching for danger. "Room for one more?" he asked from the doorway, his voice rough but not unkind. "Always," I said, and welcomed him inside. His name was Corwin, and he had been a soldier once. He did not say so directly, but one learns to recognize the marks of that life. The way he scanned the room before entering, the way he chose a seat with his back to the wall in a clear view of the door, the way his hand rested casually near his belt, even though he carried no visible weapon. He ordered ale and a bowl of whatever was hot, and I brought him the remains of last night's stew warmed over the fire. He ate in silence, his attention seemingly fixed on his food, but I noticed his eyes drifting occasionally toward the cartographer and her spread of papers. It was Elara who spoke first. "You came from the south," she said. It was not quite a question. Corwin looked up, his spoon pausing halfway to his mouth. "I did. The lowlands, near the marsh settlements." He set down his spoon. "You have sharp eyes, mapmaker. Yes, I have been walking the southern roads for 3 weeks now, visiting places I knew long ago." "Do you know them still?" she asked. There was something in her voice, a note of genuine curiosity, perhaps even hope. Corwin was quiet for a moment. "Some of them. Others have changed beyond recognition. Villages where I remember markets now lie empty. Roads I once walked are overgrown with grass." He shrugged, a gesture that carried more weight than it pretended to. "Time is the one map maker whose work is never finished." Elara smiled, a small expression that held both sadness and recognition. "That is well said." She hesitated, then seemed to reach a decision. Carefully, she turned her largest map so that he could see it from where he sat. I moved closer as well, curious despite myself. The map was unlike any I had seen before. It was large, covering most of the table, drawn on parchment that had yellowed with age. The ink was faded in places, sharp and fresh in others, as if the map had been worked on for many years by many different hands. It showed a region I did not recognize, mountains to the north, a river winding through the center, forest and settlements marked with careful notation. But there were gaps. Large sections of the map were blank, outlined but unfilled, as if waiting for information that had never arrived. "I am searching for a valley," Elara said. "My grandmother spoke of it when I was a child. She was very old then and her memories were fragmented, but she described it with such detail that I have never forgotten. A valley in the northern foothills, fed by a river that ran clear and cold from the mountains. There was a village there," she said. "Her family's village. They lived there for generations before an old conflict drove them away." And she paused, her finger tracing one of the blank spaces on the map. "I have spent 15 years searching for this valley. I have walked roads in every direction. I have spoken to historians and elders in a dozen settlements. I have found fragments, echoes, pieces that almost fit, but I cannot find the valley itself. No living soul seems to know where it was." Corwin leaned forward, studying the map with new interest. His eyes moved across the lines, the notations, the empty spaces. "This river," he said, pointing to the winding line at the center. "What did your grandmother call it?" "The Serenwash," Elara said. "She said it was named for the reeds that grew along its banks, silver in the moonlight." Corwin was silent for a long moment. Then he sat back. Something shifted in his face, a distance that comes from reaching backward through many years. "I have heard that name," he said quietly. "Once, a very long time ago." Elara's hands stilled on the map. "Where?" "In the war. The last great war of the northern provinces. 40 years past. I was young then, barely more than a boy with a sword I did not know how to use. We marched north through terrain that no map could properly show, valleys and ridges that seemed to change with the weather." He paused, his eyes unfocused, seeing something far away. "There was an old man in our company, a soldier who had served in an even earlier conflict. He spoke of the Serenwash. He said it was a river that once marked the boundary between the settled lands and the wild places beyond. He said that the villages along its banks had been abandoned before he was born, their people scattered by some calamity he did not know." "Did he say where it was?" Elara asked. "Which valley?" Corwin shook his head slowly. "He died before we reached the mountains. In ambush on a foggy morning. I never had the chance to ask him more." He fell silent, and for a moment the only sound was the crackle of the fire. "But I remember this," he said finally. He spoke of a landmark, a great stone that stood at the entrance to the valley, carved with a symbol. He said it was very old, older than any settlement, older perhaps than the river itself. He called it the Warden Stone. Elara's breath caught. A carved stone? Did he describe the symbol? He did. He said it looked like a tree with roots that mirrored its branches, reaching both up and down. I saw Elara's hand tremble as she reached into her leather case and withdrew a smaller piece of parchment, folded many times. She opened it carefully, revealing a drawing in faded ink. It was a symbol, a tree with roots that mirrored its branches, reaching both up and down. "My grandmother drew this," she whispered. "She said it was carved on a stone at the entrance to her family's valley. She said that as long as the stone stood, the valley would remember." Corwin stared at the drawing for a long moment. Then he looked up at Elara, and something passed between them, a recognition of shared searching, of pieces that had finally begun to fit. "I cannot tell you where the valley is," he said, "but I can tell you that it was real. The Serenwash was real, and perhaps somewhere in these mountains, the Warden Stone still stands." Elara nodded slowly, her eyes bright with something that might have been tears or might have been hope. "Thank you," she said. "That is more than I have learned in years." The fire crackled. Outside, the wind had grown colder, carrying with it the promise of the first true frost. But inside the inn, something warm had begun to take shape, a connection between strangers, a thread of memory reaching across decades. I returned to my work, but my thoughts remained with the map on the table, its blank spaces waiting to be filled. The afternoon wore on, and the light through the windows shifted from pale gold to deep amber. Corwin moved to a seat closer to the fire, his old soldier's bones protesting the cold that had settled into his joints during years of sleeping on hard ground. Alara remained at her table, but she had set aside her map for now, letting the new information settle into her thoughts. I prepared the evening meal, a chicken stew with leeks and early root vegetables, the kind of simple food that warms from the inside out. The aroma filled the common room, mingling with the wood smoke and the faint scent of the dried herbs above the mantel. There is a comfort in cooking that I have never been able to fully explain. The rhythm of chopping and stirring, the patience of waiting for flavors to meld, the satisfaction of offering something nourishing to those who need it. When I brought the meal to the table, Corwin accepted his bowl with genuine appreciation. He was a man accustomed to eating whatever was available, whenever it was available. And the simple pleasure of a hot meal served at a proper table clearly meant more to him than he cared to show. "You mentioned," Alara said carefully, "that you were visiting places you knew long ago. May I ask what brings you south? If it is not too personal a question." Corwin was quiet for a moment, his spoon suspended above his bowl. "My brother," he said finally, "he fell in the same war I survived, a skirmish near the southern marshes, 3 days before the fighting ended. They buried him where he fell in a small cemetery outside a village I can barely remember. You are going to find his grave. I am trying to. The village has changed. The people who knew him have died or moved on. But I have a letter he sent me just before the end. He described where he was camped, the landmarks he could see, the sound of the marsh birds at dawn. I thought, if I walked the land he walked, I might find some trace of where they laid him." Alara's expression softened with recognition. "You're out doing what I am doing," she said, "searching for something that exists only in fragments, following words and memories across terrain that has changed beyond recognition." "Well, perhaps," Corwin agreed, "though your search seems more hopeful than mine. A valley might still exist somewhere. A grave is just a marker over bones that have long since returned to the earth." "But the memory of your brother exists in you," Alara said gently, "as my grandmother's memory exists in me. Perhaps what we are really searching for is not a place at all, but a way to honor what we carry." Corwin looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his weathered face. "I had not thought of it that way," he said. "But yes, perhaps that is closer to the truth." They ate in companionable silence after that, and when the meal was finished, Corwin helped me clear the dishes without being asked. It was a small gesture, but one that spoke of a man who understood that labor shared is labor lightened. The evening deepened. I lit the candles around the room, casting pools of warm light against the encroaching darkness. The white candle on the mantelpiece burned as always, steady and unwavering, a beacon that had guided many travelers to this doorstep. Before retiring for the night, Alara unrolled her map one more time. She added a notation in her careful hand, marking the location where Corwin's old comrade had spoken of the Serenwash. It was a small addition, a few words in faded ink, but it changed the shape of the whole. The blank spaces seemed slightly smaller now, the unknown slightly more knowable. "One piece at a time," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. "That is how maps are made, one piece at a time." She rolled the map carefully and returned it to its case. Then she climbed the stairs to her room, and the inn settled into the quiet of evening. I sat by the fire for a while longer, thinking about the threads that connected these two strangers. A soldier searching for his brother's grave, a cartographer searching for her grandmother's valley, both following fragments of memory across the landscape, hoping to find something that would make their burdens lighter. Perhaps, I thought, that is what all of us are doing, walking the world with our questions and our hopes, looking for the places where our stories touch something larger, looking for the moments when we are not alone. The fire burned low, the wind whispered against the shutters, and somewhere in the darkness outside, the ancient oak tree stood watch over the crossroads, its branches reaching toward a sky full of stars that had seen 10,000 travelers pass beneath them. I added a log to the fire and went upstairs to write. The 19th day of the falling leaves moon. The herbalist couple arrived in the early afternoon. They came from the west, where the frontier homesteads spread across the wide plains like seeds scattered by a generous hand. Their cart was small, pulled by a sturdy pony with a patient expression, and loaded with carefully wrapped bundles that released the green earthy scent of dried plants whenever the wind caught them. Their names were Martin and Jonas, and they were young, perhaps 20 summers each, with the bright eyes and ready smiles of those who still find the world full of possibility. They were traveling east, they explained, to the coastal towns where herbalists were valued for their knowledge of inland plants. They hoped to establish themselves there, to build a life together in a place where the salt air might ease the lung troubles that had plagued Marin's family for generations. They were gentle with each other in the way of those whose love is still new enough to be handled carefully. Jonas helped Marin down from the cart, his hand lingering on hers. Marin brushed dust from his collar and smiled at something he murmured too quietly for others to hear. I showed them to a private room upstairs, one of the two with proper beds, and they were grateful beyond what the modest accommodation deserved. They had been sleeping in their cart for weeks, they said, and the prospect of a real mattress seemed to them a luxury beyond measure. When they came down for supper, the common room had grown fuller. Corwin still sat at his table near the wall, working through his second ale with the slow deliberation of someone who has learned to make pleasures last. Elara had not moved from her place near the hearth, though she had set aside her large map and was now sketching something in a smaller journal, her eyes distant with thought. The young couple settled at a table near the center of the room, and soon the four of them had struck up a conversation, as travelers often do when the fire is warm and the night is cold outside. It was Marin who first took interest in Elara's work. "You're a map maker?" she asked, leaning forward with genuine curiosity. "I have always found maps fascinating. How strange. that a few lines on paper can capture a whole world. Not a whole world, Ilara said, smiling faintly. Only pieces of it, and never as completely as we would wish. She explained her search, the valley, the river called Serenhollow, the Warden Stone with its ancient symbol. Marin listened with growing interest, and when Ilara described the landscape her grandmother had remembered, something flickered in the young woman's eyes. "Mountain flowers," Marin said dustily. "Did your grandmother mention the flowers?" Ilara looked up. She spoke of many things. Her memories were scattered like leaves in the wind. But yes, she mentioned flowers. She said the meadows above the village were carpeted with them in spring, tiny blue blossoms that smelled of honey and rain. Marin turned to Jonas, her expression animated. "The starwell blooms, remember? My mother spoke of them." Jonas nodded slowly. "Your mother's family came from the mountains, yes? Many generations back?" "Yes. They were displaced long before she was born, but she kept their traditions, the medicine recipes, the songs, the names of plants that grow nowhere else." Marin looked back at Ilara. "Starwell blooms, that is what they called them. Tiny blue flowers with 5 petals shaped like stars. They only grow in high valleys fed by snowmelt. My mother said her grandmother used to speak of fields of them, stretching across the meadows like fallen pieces of sky." Ilara's hand moved to her journal, and she began writing quickly. "Starwell blooms. Did your mother ever say where her family's valley was?" Marin shook her head. She did not know precisely. The knowledge was lost with the displacement. But she said the valley was high in the northern range, protected from the worst winds by a ring of peaks. She said there was a spring there that never froze, even in the deepest winter, because it was fed by something warm beneath the earth. "A warm spring," Ilara murmured, writing. "That matches something my grandmother said. She spoke of bathing in a pool that steamed in winter, surrounded by snow." The conversations continued, weaving between the 4 travelers like threads on a loom. Each offered what they knew, fragments of memory and hearsay, old stories passed down through generations. Corwin remembered his old comrades' tales of the Serenhollow, the boundary river between settled lands and wilderness. Marin shared her mother's descriptions of the starwell blooms and the warm spring. Jonas recalled hearing once from a traveling merchant that there had been settlements in the northern mountains long before the current kingdoms were founded, places that were abandoned so completely that even their names were forgotten. I listened from my place near the kitchen, stirring the evening stew and watching the way their words built upon each other. It reminded me of the way a stone wall is constructed, each piece finding its place, the whole becoming stronger than any single part. Ilara spread her map on the table again, and the others gathered around it. She marked new details as they spoke, filling in some of the blank spaces with tentative lines and notations. A river here, a mountain range there, a notation about blue flowers in high meadows. "It is still incomplete," she said, when they finally sat back, the evening having grown late around them. "But it is more complete than it was this morning. For that, I am grateful." "Perhaps more travelers will come," Marin offered. "Perhaps others will know pieces we do not." "Perhaps," Ilara agreed. But there was something in her voice, a wistfulness that suggested she had hoped for many things over the years and learned not to hope too strongly. The fire burned low, the candles guttered. I brought fresh cider for those who wanted it, and the conversation slowly wound down into the comfortable silence of tired travelers, ready for rest. As they climbed the stairs to their rooms, I found myself standing before Ilara's map, studying its lines in the fading firelight. The blank spaces seemed to pulse with possibility, like chapters of a story waiting to be written. I did not know then that the story was only beginning. The rest of the afternoon passed gently. Marin helped me prepare the evening meal, her hands skilled with herbs in a way that came from long practice. She showed me a technique her mother had taught her, a way of releasing the oils from a rosemary by pressing the needles between the palms before adding them to the pot. The scent filled the kitchen, green and sharp, and somehow hopeful. My mother learned it from her grandmother, Marin explained, and she from her grandmother before that. These small things, the ways of preparing food, the names of plants, the songs we sing while working, they travel through generations like water through soil. You cannot see them, but they are always there feeding the roots. Your family must have deep roots, I observed. Scattered ones, she said, with a smile that held no bitterness. My mother's people were displaced long ago from somewhere in the mountains. My father's people came from the eastern marshes before the floods changed the land. Jonas's family were miners until the veins ran dry. All of us come from places that no longer exist as they once were. And yet you carry them with you. What else can we do? The places change, but the memories remain. The recipes, the songs, the stories, the way my mother described the high meadows, even though she never saw them herself. The way Jonas's grandfather spoke of the deep mines, even though they closed before Jonas was born. She paused, her hands stilling over the herbs. I think that is why we are traveling east, she said, not just for the salt air and the opportunities, but because we want to plant new roots somewhere before the old ones fade. We want to have children someday, and we want those children to have a place that is theirs, a place they can describe to their grandchildren, even if it changes, even if it becomes something else. Her words stayed with me as I served the evening meal. The common room had grown crowded with meaning. 4 travelers gathered around a map that had become something more than parchment and ink. It had become a confluence, a place where separate streams of memory merged and mingled. After the meal, Jonas took out a small wooden flute he carried in his pack and played a few quiet melodies. They were simple tunes, the kind that settle into the bones and make the body want to sway. Marin hummed along with some of them, and even Corwin, who seemed like a man unaccustomed to music, tapped his foot against the flagstones. That one, Ilara said suddenly, as Jonas finished a particularly gentle air. That melody. Do you know where it comes from? Jonas looked at his flute, as if the answer might be written on its surface. My grandfather taught it to me, he said. He learned it from a traveler who passed through the mining camps when he was young. He called it the shepherd's rest, though I do not know why. Ilara's eyes had gone distant. My grandmother used to hum that tune, she said quietly, when she thought no one was listening. She never told me where she learned it. I assumed it was something from her childhood, but she never spoke of her childhood in detail. Perhaps it was common once, Marin offered, a song that traveled the mountain roads before the passes closed. Perhaps, Ilara agreed, but her voice held a new texture, a thread of wonder woven through the weariness. The evening continued in this way, each small discovery adding to the growing sense of connection. A tune that two grandparents had known, a flower that two families remembered, a river name that echoed across decades. Individually, these were small things, easily dismissed as coincidence, but taken together, they formed a pattern, faint but unmistakable. A pattern that spoke of a shared origin, a common root that had branched and scattered across the land. By the time the travelers retired for the night, Ilara's map had gained 3 new notations, and her journal had gained 3 more pages of careful notes. But more than that, something had shifted in her bearing. The loneliness she had carried when she arrived seemed lighter now, less like a burden and more like a bridge. I cleaned the common room after everyone had gone upstairs. I swept the hearth and banked the fire. I checked the latches on the doors and windows, and then I stood for a moment by the white candle on the mantelpiece, watching its flame burn steady in the darkness. "Welcome them all," the old woman had said, so many years ago, and I had tried. But tonight, I wondered if my welcome had done something more than offer shelter. Tonight, I wondered if it had offered connection. The flame flickered once as if in answer. I took my journal and climbed the stairs to write. The 20th day of the falling leaves moon, the beekeeper arrived with the morning frost. I found him standing at the edge of the crossroads when I went out to check on the chickens. Hey, an old man with a weathered face and hands that moved with the slow deliberation of one who has spent his life among creatures that punish haste. He wore a heavy coat patched in many places, and beside him stood a cart loaded with wooden boxes that hummed faintly, even in the cold. "Your bees," I said, approaching carefully. "They're still alive." He smiled, revealing gaps where teeth had once been. "They sleep, but yes, they live. They know how to survive the cold if given the chance." His name was Edmond, and he was returning from the northern mountains, where he had taken his hives to feed on the late wildflowers that bloomed in the high meadows. It was a long journey, he admitted, and harder each year, but the mountain honey was prized in the lowland markets, and the income sustained him through the winters. I invited him inside, and he accepted gratefully. His bones ached with the cold, he said, and a warm fire would do more for him than any medicine. In the common room, the other travelers were already gathered. Corwin had taken his usual seat near the wall, nursing a mug of hot tea. Marin and Jonas sat together by the window, sharing a plate of bread and cheese. And Ilara, as always, had claimed the table near the hearth, her map spread before her, her journal open at her elbow. Edmund settled onto a bench near the fire, and I brought him a bowl of porridge and a cup of the elderflower tea that my grandmother used to make for cold mornings. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, and gradually the color returned to his cheeks. It was Marin who first noticed his interest in the map. "You have been looking at Elara's work," she said. "Do you know maps?" Edmund shook his head. "I know bees and flowers and weather, but I know also that some things cannot be mapped, no matter how skilled the hand that tries." "What do you mean?" Elara asked, looking up from her notes. The old beekeeper was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice had the cadence of one telling a story he had told many times before. "My grandfather was a beekeeper, as was his father before him. They kept hives in the valleys north of here, in places that were green and wild long before anyone thought to build roads. My grandfather spoke of a valley once where the flowers bloomed so thickly that the air itself seemed made of honey. He called it the Valley of the Thousand Petals." Elara's pen stopped moving. "He said his own grandfather had kept hives there in a time before the old wars. But the wars came, and the people were scattered, and the valley was forgotten. When my grandfather tried to find it, as a young man, he could not. The passes that led to it were choked with stone and fallen trees, and the maps of the region showed nothing but empty space." "Did he describe the valley?" Elara asked. "Its location, its features?" Edmund nodded slowly. "He said it was ringed by peaks, protected from the harsh winds. He said there was a river running through it fed by snowmelt and a spring that never froze, and he said there was a great stone at the entrance, carved with an ancient symbol that marked the boundary between the world of men and something older." The room had grown very still. "The Warden Stone," Corwin said quietly. "I do not know its name," Edmund said. "But my grandfather described the carving, a tree with roots that mirrored its branches, reaching both up and down. He said it was placed there by people who understood that some places are sacred and that such places must be marked so that others might know to tread carefully." Elara rose from her seat and crossed to the old man. In her hand, she held a small piece of parchment with her grandmother's drawing. "This symbol?" she asked, showing him the image. Edmund studied it for a long moment. Then he looked up at her, and there was something in his eyes, a recognition that went beyond words. "Yes," he said, "that is the one. My grandfather carved a copy of it on a beam in our old house. Before it burned, I thought I would never see it again." Elara's hands were trembling. "Your grandfather's valley and my grandmother's village, they may be the same place." "Perhaps," Edmund said. "Or perhaps there were many such valleys once, each with its own stone, each lost to time and war. The mountains are old, and they keep their secrets." "But if they were the same place," Elara pressed, "then perhaps between what you remember and what I have gathered, we could find it." Edmund was quiet for a long moment. Then he sighed. a sound that carried the weight of many years. "I am too old to search for lost valleys," he said. "My journey now is to the southern lowlands, where I will sell my honey and rest my bones. But I will tell you what I remember, every detail my grandfather shared, and perhaps with enough pieces you will find what you are seeking." The morning stretched into afternoon as Edmund spoke. He described the journey his grandfather had attempted, the passes he had tried and found blocked, the landmarks he had recognized from older stories. He spoke of the flowers that grew in the high valleys, the starwell blooms with their honey-sweet scent, the red-tipped ferns that only grew near warm springs. He spoke of the river that ran clear and cold, and the sound it made as it tumbled over smooth stones. Elara wrote everything down. Her pen moved across the pages of her journal, filling them with notes and sketches and questions. Marin added details from her own family's memories, and Corwin contributed what he remembered of his old comrades' tales. Even Jonas, who had no connection to the mountains, offered observations about trade routes and travel times. That might help narrow the search. By the time the afternoon light began to fade, Elara's map had grown richer. New lines marked possible passes. New notations indicated landmarks and features. The blank spaces were still there, but they seemed smaller now, less like absences and more like mysteries waiting to be solved. "I cannot promise this will lead you to your valley," Edmund said as the conversation wound down. "But I can promise that the valley was real. My grandfather knew it. His grandfather lived there. And somewhere in these mountains, the stones still remember." Elara nodded, her eyes bright with something that I had not seen in her before. Hope, perhaps. Or simply the comfort of knowing that she was not alone in her searching. "Thank you," she said. All of you. You have given me more than you know." Edmund smiled, the expression deepening the creases in his weathered face. "That is the way of things, is it not? We give what we have, not knowing where it will land, seeds scattered by the wind. Most fall on barren ground, but some find soil. Some grow. Your grandfather sounds like he was a philosopher as well as a beekeeper," Elara observed. "He was a man who paid attention," Edmund said. "That is all. He watched his bees for 50 years, and he learned that patience matters more than force. He watched the seasons change, and he learned that everything has its time. He listened to the old stories, and he learned that memory travels farther than the body ever can." He paused, his eyes growing distant. "He told me once that bees remember things we have forgotten. They know the old paths, the ancient routes between flowers that bloomed before the roads were built. They carry maps in their blood, he said, maps that were drawn before humans learned to make marks on paper." "Do you believe that?" Marin asked. "I believe that there are many ways of knowing," Edmund said, "and not all of them can be written down." The afternoon light had shifted while we talked, the pale gold of midday deepening toward the amber of approaching evening. Through the window, I could see the oak tree at the crossroads, its branches stark against the gray sky. A few leaves still clung to the highest limbs, but most had fallen now. forming a carpet of copper and rust beneath the ancient trunk. Edmund rose slowly, his bones creaking audibly. "I should check on my bees," he said. "They grow restless when they are away from home for too long, even sleeping, and they know when something is wrong." "I will come with you," I offered. "I would like to see them, if you would permit it." He nodded, and together we walked out into the cold afternoon. The cart stood where he had left it, the wooden boxes arranged in neat rows. As we approached, I could hear it, a faint humming, low and steady, like the distant memory of summer. "They are not truly asleep," Edmund explained, pressing his ear against one of the boxes. "They cluster together for warmth, and they slow their movements, but they remain aware. They feel the vibrations of the world around them. They know when spring is coming long before we do." How? I do not know. Perhaps they sense the lengthening days. Perhaps they feel the change in the earth itself. Perhaps they simply remember, in whatever way bees remember, and they know that winter always ends. He adjusted the woolen blankets he had wrapped around the boxes, tucking them more tightly against the cold. "My grandfather used to say that bees are the keepers of the calendar. He said they measured time not in days and weeks, but in blooms. First the crocuses, then the apple blossoms, then the clover, then the goldenrod. Each flower marks a chapter in the year, and the bees read that story better than any scholar." We stood in silence for a moment, listening to the hum of the sleeping hives. "Elara's Valley," I said. "Do you truly believe it exists somewhere?" Edmund was quiet for a long moment. "I believe that my grandfather believed it," he said finally. "And his grandfather before him. Whether that means the valley exists as a place you can walk to, I cannot say. But I know this much. The memory of that valley has traveled through 4 generations of my family, passed from grandfather to grandson like a treasured heirloom. It has shaped us, guided us, given us a sense of belonging even when we had nowhere to belong. If that is not real, then I do not know what real means." We returned to the inn as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The common room was warm and welcoming, the fire burning brightly, the candles casting their pools of golden light. The other travelers had gathered around Elara's table, studying the map, adding their own observations to the growing collection of fragments. Edmund settled into his chair by the fire and closed his eyes. Within minutes, his breathing had deepened into the steady rhythm of sleep. I watched him for a moment, this old man with his sleeping bees and his inherited memories, and I thought about what he had said, about seeds scattered by the wind, about patience and attention, about the many ways of knowing that cannot be written down. The fire crackled, the candle burned, and somewhere in the darkness outside, the ancient oak tree stood watch over the crossroads, its roots reaching deep into soil that remembered more than any map could show. Or to the 21st day of the falling leaves moon. The bookbinder came in from the cold just as the sun touched the western hills. I heard her before I saw her, the peculiar rattling sound of a cart loaded with something heavy and fragile. When I stepped outside to investigate, I found a small woman wrestling with a wheel that had wedged itself into a rut near the hitching post. She was muttering under her breath words I could not quite make out, but which carried the distinct tone of creative frustration. "May I help?" I offered. She looked up, startled, then laughed. It was a warm sound, unexpected and genuine. "If you can convince this wheel to behave, I will owe you a debt beyond repaying." Together, we freed the wheel and guided her cart to a safer resting place near the stable. The cart was loaded with wooden crates, and through the gaps in the slats, I could see the spines of books, the edges of bound manuscripts, the tools of a craft I had always admired but never learned. Her name was Theodora, and she was a traveling bookbinder. She moved between settlements and towns, mending old books, rebinding damaged manuscripts, and sometimes creating new volumes for those who wanted their words preserved. It was lonely work, she admitted, but it suited her. She preferred the company of books to the company of most people. "Books do not argue," she said as I led her into the common room. "They do not change their minds or say things they do not mean. They simply wait to be read, patient and reliable." The other travelers had grown accustomed to each other over the past days, and they welcomed Theodora with the easy hospitality of those who understand what it means to be far from home. Ilara cleared space at her table for the bookbinder's satchel, and Marin poured her a cup of tea without being asked. Theodora settled into the warmth of the inn, her eyes moving with professional interest over the room's details. She noted the quality of the timber beams, the craftsmanship of the furniture, the leather cover of my father's journal, where it rested on the mantelpiece. "You keep records," she observed, nodding toward the journal. "I try to remember," I said, "the travelers, the seasons, the stories that pass through. This place has seen much over the years." "All places have," she agreed. "The difference is whether someone takes the time to write it down." The conversation drifted, as conversations do, and eventually it found its way to Ilara's map. By now, the cartographer had grown accustomed to explaining her search, and she did so with a weariness that spoke of many such explanations over many years. But Theodora listened with unusual attention. When Ilara finished, the bookbinder was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tapping thoughtfully against her cup. "The Serenhollow," she said finally. "I have encountered that name." Ilara's head came up sharply. "Where?" "In a book, a very old book, badly damaged, that I was asked to repair 3 winters past. It was a chronicle of some kind, handwritten in an old dialect that I could barely read. The owner did not know its origin, only that it had been in his family for generations." "What did it say about the Serenhollow?" Theodora closed her eyes, reaching back through memory. "Not much that I understood. The dialect was archaic, the handwriting difficult. But I remember one passage. It spoke of a river called the Serenhollow that marked the boundary between the kingdoms of men and the forgotten places. It said that along this river there were once 7 villages, each with its own guardian stone, And it said that when the stones were lost, the villages would be lost with them, forgotten by all except the river itself. 7 villages, Ilara breathed. 7 stones. That's what it said. I do not know if it was history or legend. Often in very old books, it is difficult to tell the difference. Ilara was already reaching for her journal, her pen moving rapidly. Did the chronicle say where these villages were? Which mountains? Which passes? I do not think so. If it did, I did not understand it. But Theodora paused, frowning. There was a map at the back of the book, very faded, almost illegible. I remember thinking it looked nothing like the maps I was accustomed to. The proportions were wrong, or perhaps the perspective was simply different. But there were marks on it, symbols that looked like trees with mirrored roots. 7 symbols? Corwin asked. 1 for each village? I cannot say. The map was badly damaged. Much of it was lost to water stains and decay. But yes, there were symbols, several of them at least. Ilara set down her pen. Do you remember where this book is now? Who owned it? Theodora shook her head slowly. The owner has since passed, and I do not know what became of his possessions. But she hesitated. I made copies of some pages. I do not always do so, but the book was so unusual, so unlike anything I'd seen before, that I wanted to study the binding techniques. I kept sketches of some of the illustrations, including a partial copy of the map. The room seemed to hold its breath. I have them with me, Theodora continued. In my cart, I keep examples of interesting work for reference. If you would like, I can look for them. Ilara rose so quickly that her chair scraped loudly against the floor. Please, if you could, I would be more grateful than I can express. Theodora smiled and set down her cup. Give me a few minutes. My filing system is personal. She returned to the cold evening, and the rest of us waited. The fire crackled. Marin held Jonas's hand. Edmund dozed lightly in his chair, and Ilara stood at the window, watching the bookbinder's silhouette move around the cart, her breath fogging the glass. When Theodora returned, she carried a worn leather folder bound with cord. She untied it carefully, reverently, and spread its contents on the table beside Ilara's map. There were sketches of binding techniques, diagrams of stitching patterns, notes on leather preservation, but among them, there were also copies of illustrations, strange figures in archaic clothing, buildings that looked nothing like any I had seen, and at the very bottom, a partial map drawn in faded ink. Ilara's hand trembled as she lifted it. The map was incomplete, its edges lost to the damage Theodora had described. But what remained showed a winding line that could only be a river, mountain peaks sketched in the distance and scattered across the evening. Terrain, small symbols, trees with mirrored roots. At least 4 of them were visible, marking locations along the river's path. The guardian stones, Ilara whispered. The 7 villages. Or what remains of them, Theodora said. If the chronicle was accurate, and if my copy is faithful to the original. Ilara looked up, and there were tears in her eyes. Not of sadness, I thought, but of something else. Relief, perhaps. Or the overwhelming weight of hope suddenly made tangible. All these years, she said, her voice barely audible, all these years I've been searching alone. And in 1 week, in this inn at the crossroads, I have found more than I've found in 15 years of wandering. Perhaps the crossroads brought you what you needed, Marin offered gently. Perhaps this is where the pieces were meant to come together. Elara laughed, a sound that was half sob and half joy. Perhaps it is. I looked at the white candle on the mantelpiece, its flame burning steady and true, and I wondered, not for the first time, whether the old woman who gave it to me had known something about this place that I was only beginning to understand. The night deepened around us. One by one, the travelers drifted off to their beds until only Elara and I remained. She sat staring at Theodora's map, tracing the symbols with her finger, murmuring words too soft for me to hear. "You should rest," I said gently. "The map will still be here in the morning." "I know," she said, "but I'm afraid that if I close my eyes, I will wake to find this has all been a dream, that the map will be blank again, and the memories will have scattered like leaves." "Dreams do not bring ink and parchment," I said, "and they do not gather strangers from 4 directions to share fragments of the same forgotten valley. What has happened here is real. Whatever else you may doubt, do not doubt that." She looked at me, and something in her expression softened. "You're very kind," she said, "to open your doors to all of us, to listen to our stories, to let us spread our maps and our memories across your tables. It is what this place is for," I said. "It has always been what this place is for." She nodded slowly, accepting the answer, even if she did not fully understand it. "Good night, then," she said, rolling the map carefully and tucking it into her case. "And thank you for everything." She climbed the stairs, and the inn fell into the silence of the very late hours. I sat alone by the fire, watching the last of the flames die down to embers. On the mantelpiece, the white candle burned on, steady and true as it had burned through every night since that first winter. And for a moment, just a moment, its flame seemed to pulse with something that might have been satisfaction, as if it too had been waiting for this gathering, as if it too had known, yet the pieces would eventually find their way home. The 22nd day of the falling leaves moon, the child arrived with her uncle the following afternoon. They came from the east on horses that looked weary from days of travel. The uncle was a merchant, his saddlebags filled with bolts of fine cloth destined for the frontier settlements. The child was perhaps 8 or 9, with dark hair braided in 2 thick plaits, and eyes that seemed too old for her small face. Her name was Lyra, and she did not speak to strangers. The uncle explained apologetically that Lyra had not spoken since the death of her mother the previous spring. She was traveling with him now because there was no one else to care for her, and he hoped that the change of scenery might help her find her voice again. "She's no trouble," he assured me. "She eats what is given her and sleeps when she is tired. She simply does not speak." I showed them to a room, and the uncle went out to tend to the horses. Lyra remained in the common room, sitting on a bench near the window, her small hands folded in her lap. She watched the other travelers with quiet curiosity, saying nothing. The evening meal was livelier than usual. Theodora had been studying Alara's map alongside her own copied illustrations, and the two of them had made progress in matching landmarks and features. Corwin offered observations about terrain and travel times based on his military experience. Edmund shared more memories from his grandfather's stories. Marin and Jonas has contributed what they knew of mountain plants and the conditions they required to grow. Lyra watched it all, her eyes moving from speaker to speaker. It was late in the evening, after the meal had been cleared and the adults had settled into quieter conversation, that the child approached Alara's table. She moved silently, as children sometimes do, and stood at the edge of the map without speaking. Alara looked up, surprised, then smiled gently. "Hello," she said. "Would you like to see the map?" Lyra did not answer, but she moved closer, her eyes fixed on the parchment. Alara shifted to make room, and the child climbed onto the bench beside her. For a long moment she simply looked, her gaze tracing the links and symbols with an intensity that seemed beyond her years. Then she pointed. Her small finger touched one of the blank spaces on the map, an area in the northern mountains where Alara had not yet been able to determine the terrain. Alara looked at her. "Do you know something about this place?" Lyra did not speak. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her dress and withdrew a folded piece of paper. She opened it carefully and laid it on the table. It was a drawing, a child's drawing, done in charcoal and faded color, but rendered with surprising skill. It showed a valley surrounded by mountains, a river running through its center, and scattered along the valley floor, tiny buildings that might have been houses or might have been something else entirely. And at the entrance to the valley, standing like a sentinel, a great stone carved with a symbol, a tree with roots that mirrored its branches. The room had gone completely silent. Alara looked from the drawing to the child, her face pale with shock. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lyra met her eyes, and then, for the first time since her uncle had arrived, she spoke. "My mother drew it," she said. Her voice was soft, rusty with agues, but clear. "She said it was the place where her grandmother was born. She said the valley was gone, but she wanted to remember." Alara's hands were shaking as she reached out to touch the drawing. "Your mother," she said. "What was her family name? Where did they come from?" "Serenhollow," Lyra said. "My mother's grandmother was Arena Serenhollow. She came from a valley in the mountains, but she left when she was young and never went back." Hey, Lara made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. "Serenhollow," she repeated. "My grandmother's name was Elise Serenwater. The names, they are so close. They must have been from the same place, the same valley. Lyra looked at her with those two old eyes. My mother said the valley was destroyed, she said. She said the people scattered to many places, and they all changed their names a little, so no one would know they were connected. But she said they carried the valley with them, in their hearts, in their drawings, in the names they gave their children. Ilara was weeping openly now, tears streaming down her cheeks as she looked at the child's drawing. All this time, she whispered, all this time I have been searching for a place, but the place is not somewhere I can walk to. The place is here. She touched her heart in the people who remember. Lyra nodded, as if this were obvious. My mother remembered, she said, and now you know, and now the valley is not forgotten anymore. The uncle had returned by then, standing in the doorway with a look of astonishment on his face. He had not heard his niece speak in 8 months. But Lyra was not finished. She looked around the room at all the travelers gathered there, at the fragments of memory and story that they had contributed. The valley was called Serenhollow, she said. My mother told me before she had died. It was the real name, the one everyone tried to forget it, Serenhollow, in the high mountains where the river ran clear and the stones remembered. Ilara wrote the name on her map in the center of the largest blank space, Serenhollow. After 15 years of searching, she finally knew where she was looking for. The common room fell into a profound stillness after Lyra spoke the name, Serenhollow. It hung in the air like incense, filling the spa space with something that was neither scent nor sound, but had the quality of both. Corwin had risen from his seat and moved closer to the table, drawn by the weight of the moment. Edmund had awakened and sat watching with eyes that shone in the firelight. Marin held Jonas's hand tightly, and Theodora had pressed her fingers to her lips, as if holding back words that could not adequately capture what she was witnessing. And Lyra stood at the center of it all, this small child who had broken her silence to give away her mother's most precious memory. How did your mother know this name? Ilara asked, her voice trembling. The name Serenhollow. If it was truly forgotten, how could she have known it? Lyra tilted her head, considering the question with an earnestness beyond her years. She dreamed it, the child said. She told me that she had dreamed of the valley all her life. In her dreams, she walked through the streets of a village that no longer existed. She heard people speaking a language she almost understood. She saw the stone at the entrance, and she heard them call it by name, the Valley of Serenhollow, where the river ran clear. Dreams, Edmund murmured. My grandfather spoke of such dreams. He said that sometimes, when a place is lost, it finds its way into the dreams of those who carry it. It whispers its name into their sleeping ears, hoping that someone will remember. That sounds like superstition, Corwin said, but his voice lacked conviction. Perhaps, Edmund agreed. Or perhaps it is something else entirely. Perhaps memory does not belong only to the mind. Perhaps it can travel through blood and bone, passed down from parent to child like the color of eyes or the shape of hands. Ilara looked at Lyra's drawing again, at the careful lines and faded colors. "Your mother was an artist," she said softly. "This is very well done for someone who never saw what she was drawing." She drew it many times," Lyra said, "over and over until she got it right. She said the dream was always the same, so she knew exactly what it should look like. Sometimes she would wake in the night and draw for hours, trying to capture something she had just seen." "And she gave the drawings to you?" Lyra nodded. "She gave me all of them before she died. She said I should keep them safe because the valley was my inheritance. Not land or money or things, but memory, the memory of where we came from, even if we could never go back." Ilara's eyes overflowed, tears streaming down her tusik checked. "My grandmother said something similar," she whispered. "She said that we came from a valley of silver water and sweet air, and that even though the valley was gone, we carried it inside us. She said that as long as we remembered, the valley was not truly lost." "It is not lost," Lyra said simply. "You remember, I remember. All these people remember pieces of it. The valley is here, in all of us." The uncle, who had been standing in stunned silence near the doorway, finally found his voice. "Lyra," he said, his tone wavering between wonder and relief. "You spoke. You have not spoken in 8 months, and now you speak to strangers about things your mother told you in secret." Lyra turned to look at him, her expression calm. "They are not strangers," she said. "They are family. We all come from the same place, even if we did not know it. My mother would have wanted me to tell them." The uncle's eyes filled with tears. He crossed the room and knelt beside his niece, pulling her into an embrace that she tolerated with quiet dignity. "Your mother would be so proud of you," he said, his voice muffled against her hair. "So proud." Lyra patted his shoulder with a gesture that seemed oddly adult. "I know," she said. "That is why I spoke." The evening continued, but the mood had shifted into something deeper. The travelers gathered close, sharing what they knew and what they half remembered. Corwin described the terrain his old comrade had spoken of, and Ilara noted how it matched certain features on Theodora's copied map. Edmund recalled his grandfather's descriptions of the valley entrance, and Marin added details about the flowers that might grow in such a place. Together, piece by piece, they built a picture of Serenhollow. Not a complete picture, but something more than any of them had possessed alone. A composite memory, assembled from fragments that had traveled separately for generations, finally reunited at this crossroads where 2 ancient roads met beneath an oak tree that was older than any of them could guess. I watched from the kitchen doorway, my hands busy with the evening chores, but my attention fixed on the gathering around the table. There was something sacred happening here, I realized, something that went beyond the simple act of sharing information. These travelers were weaving themselves together, binding their separate histories into a single strand that would outlast any of them. The fire burned steady, the candles flickered, and on the mantelpiece, the white candle that had burned since that first winter seemed to glow a little brighter, as if acknowledging that its purpose was being fulfilled. The 23rd day of the falling leaves, moon, on today was a day of departures. Corwin left at first light, continuing his journey south. He shook hands with each of us, and when he reached Ilara, he paused. Us. I hope you find it, he said, the valley, even if only in memory. I already have, she replied. In a way, I have found it here. He nodded, a soldier's acknowledgement, and walked out into the cold morning. I watched him go, his figure growing smaller on the southern road until the mist swallowed him whole. Edmund followed an hour later, his cart of sleeping bees loaded and ready. The old beekeeper had lingered over his breakfast, reluctant to leave the warmth, but the road called and he answered. Tell your bees about the valley, Ilara said as he departed. Perhaps they will remember too. He laughed at that, a sound as warm as summer honey, and promised that he would. Marin and Jonas stayed until midday, helping me with some repairs around the inn. Jonas was skilled with tools, and he mended a loose step on the staircase that had been troubling me for weeks. Marin spent the morning in the kitchen garden despite the cold, pruning dead growth and preparing the beds for winter. We will come back, she promised as they finally climbed onto their cart. When we are settled in the east, we will come back and tell you how the starwell blooms in our new garden. I will hold you to that, I said, and meant it. Theodora left shortly after, her cart of books and tools ready for the next settlement that needed her services. She had given Ilara copies of all her sketches, and the two women had spent the previous evening comparing notes and theories about the old chronicle and its mysterious map. If I ever find another book like it, Theodora said, I will send word. And if I ever find the valley, Ilara replied, I will send word to you. The uncle and Lyra departed last. The child had spoken more in the past day than in all the months since her mother's death, and her uncle's relief was evident in everything he did. He thanked us all repeatedly for whatever miracle had occurred in this inn at the crossroads. But it was Lyra who offered the final gift. Before climbing onto her horse, she walked to Ilara and handed her the drawing. My mother would want you to have it, she said. She always said the valley should not be forgotten. Ilara took this drawing with trembling hands. Are you sure this is your mother's work? My mother is gone, Lyra said with the simple honesty of children. But the valley is still here, in you now and in your map. She turned and walked to her uncle's side, and they rode away down the eastern road without looking back. But before they disappeared from sight, I saw Lyra turn in her saddle and look back at the inn. She raised her hand in a small wave, a gesture of acknowledgement or farewell. And then the eastern road curved behind a stand of trees, and she was gone. I stood at the doorstep for a long moment after she vanished, thinking about the strange gift she had given. A child's silence, broken, a mother's memory shared, a valley's name spoken aloud for the first time in perhaps 100 years. The air was cold, and I could see my breath forming small clouds that dissipated almost as quickly as they appeared. Winter was coming in earnest now. The oak tree at the crossroads had lost nearly all its leaves, its branches tracing dark patterns against the gray sky. Soon the first snow would fall, and the roads would grow difficult, and travelers would become rare until the spring thaw. But for now, in this brief moment between autumn and winter, the crossroads had been a place of gathering, a place where fragments found each other and began to form a whole. I returned inside, thinking about what Edmund had said about seeds scattered by the wind. Most fall on barren ground, but some find soil, some grow. This week, soil had been found. Something had taken root by us. Evening, only Ilara remained. She sat at her table near the hearth, surrounded by papers and notes and sketches. Her map lay open before her, more complete than it had ever been. The blank spaces were still there, but they were smaller now, surrounded by the fragments of memory that the travelers had contributed. "Will you continue searching?" I asked, setting a cup of tea beside her. She looked up, and for the first time since her arrival, she looked at peace. "Yeah," she said, "but differently. I came here looking for a place. I thought that if I could find the valley, I could find what I had lost. My grandmother, my family, my connection to something larger than myself." She paused, looking down at her map. "But this week has taught me that the place I was seeking is not something I can walk to. It is something I must piece together from the memories of those who remember. The valley exists in fragments, scattered across 100 hearts. The Serenhollow runs through the stories of the old soldiers who heard its name in campfire tales. The starwell blooms grow in the medicine songs of the herbalists who preserve their knowledge. The warden stone stands in the chronicles of the bookbinders who copy ancient texts." She touched Lyra's drawing, gentle and reverent. "And Serenhollow lives in the drawings of the children whose mothers remembered." I sat down across from her, my own cup of tea warming my hands. Perhaps that is how all lost places survive," I offered. "Not in stone and timber, but in the hearts of those who carry them." Ilara smiled. "Perhaps, and perhaps that is enough." She began to roll up her map, handling it with the care of something precious. "I will leave in the morning," she said. "I have a long journey ahead, but not the same journey I began. I am no longer searching for a valley. I am searching for the people who remember it. And when I have gathered enough memories, I will write them down. A book, a chronicle of Serenhollow, pieced together from 100 different hearts." "A cartography of memory," I said. Her eyes brightened. "Yes, exactly. A map not of terrain, but of remembrance." The fire crackled. The candle burned steady on the mantelpiece. And outside, the wind carried the first true breath of winter down from the mountains. "Will you come back?" I asked. "When your book is finished?" Ilara looked around the common room, at the flagstone floor and the dried herbs and the old weathered beams, at the window that faced the crossroads, and the ancient oak tree standing sentinel outside. "Yes," she said, "this place is part of the story now. The crossroads where the pieces came together. I could not write the book without including it. Then I will keep a place for you," I said, "by the fire, with tea and stew and a bed that remembers how to welcome a weary traveler." She reached across the table and took my hand. "Thank you," she said, "for the room, for the food, for the fire." She paused. "And for the space to stop searching and start finding." I squeezed her hand, and no more words were needed. The 24th day of the falling leaves moon, Alara left with the dawn. I watched her from the doorway as she walked down the road, her leather case strapped to her back, her map rolled and protected within. She did not look back, but at the crossroads, where the two ancient roads met beneath the branches of the oak tree, she paused. From where I stood, I could not see her face, but I saw her reach out and touch the bark of the tree, a gesture of greeting or farewell. And I saw her look up into its branches, as if searching for something among the last clinging leaves. Then she chose her road and walked on, heading north toward the mountains, toward the scattered memories of Serenhollow that waited to be gathered. The inn was quiet after she left. I spent the morning cleaning the guest chambers, washing the linens, sweeping the floors. Simple work, but satisfying in its simplicity. The kind of work that leaves the hands busy and the mind free to wander. I thought about the travelers who had passed through this week. Corwin, the soldier carrying old sorrows south. Edmund, the beekeeper with his sleeping bees and his grandfather's stories. Marin and Jonas, young and hopeful, carrying seeds for a new life. Theodora, the bookbinder preserving the past in leather and thread. Lyra, the child who found her voice in the act of giving away her mother's memory. And Alara, the cartographer who came looking for a valley and found something larger. A web of connections spanning generations and miles. A map not of terrain, but of the human heart. I thought about my own place in it. This inn, this crossroads, this life of welcoming strangers and feeding fires. My father built these walls. My grandmother taught me to cook. My mother taught me to listen. And somewhere, somehow, I had learned to make this place a point of gathering, a space where travelers could stop and rest and sometimes find more than they expected. The white candle burned on the mantelpiece, steady and unchanging. It had burned through every night since that first winter, when the old woman walked on top of the snow and blessed this place. Welcome them all, she had said, and I had tried. Every traveler, every stranger, every weary soul who knocked on my door, but I wondered now if she had meant something more. If the welcome was not just about food and shelter, but about something deeper. About creating a space where memories could meet, where fragments could come together, where the scattered pieces of lost things could find each other and begin to be whole again. I did not know, perhaps I would never know, but I knew that I would continue, day after day, season after season, welcoming whoever the roads might bring. In the afternoon, I took my journal from the mantelpiece and climbed the narrow stairs to my chamber, the ceiling to open overhead. and I had to stoop as I crossed to my desk. The small window faced east, toward the mountains, and through it I could see the road Ilara had taken, winding into the distance until it disappeared. Among the foothills, I sat at my desk, opened my journal, and began to write. I wrote about the cartographer and her search. I wrote about the fragments of memory that came together in my common room. I wrote about Lyra's drawing and the moment when a silent child spoke the name of a forgotten valley. And I wrote about what I had learned, that some places cannot be mapped because they exist only in the hearts of those who remember them. That the road does not only take us to destinations, but sometimes brings destinations to us. That hospitality is not just about providing shelter, but about creating space for connection. The light faded as I wrote. The candle in my chamber burned low, but still I continued, filling page after page with the story of this week, this gathering, this small miracle at the crossroads. When I finally set down my pen, the evening had grown dark. I could see stars through my window, bright and cold above the mountains. Somewhere out there, Ilara was walking. Somewhere out there, the memory of Serenhollow was waiting to be found. And here, in this inn at the crossroads, I was waiting too. Waiting for the next traveler, the next story, the next fragment of memory, seeking its home. I closed my journal and went downstairs to tend the fire. The common room was empty, but it did not feel lonely. It felt expectant, ready, open for whoever might come next. I stirred the embers and added fresh wood. The flames caught and grew, casting their warm light across the flagstones and the old wooden beams. The herbs rustled above the mantel. The white candle burned steady and true. Tomorrow, or the day after, someone would knock on my door. They would come in from the cold, seeking warmth and rest. They would bring their own burdens and hope and secrets, and I would welcome them as I had welcomed all the others, as I would welcome all who came, because that is what this place is for. A crossroads, a meeting point, a space where the lost can find themselves and the scattered can come together and the forgotten can begin to be remembered. I sat by the fire and watched the flames dance, and I waited.
Thank you for joining me tonight at the Crossroads Inn. I hope the warmth of the fire and the quiet of these stories have brought you some peace. If this journey brought you comfort, consider leaving a like or subscribing to the channel. And if you know someone who could use a place to rest, share this story with them. The innkeeper will be here again whenever you need him. There is always room at the crossroads for one more weary traveler. Until we meet again, sleep well. May your dreams be gentle, and may you always find your way home. Good night.